Hi, this time we'll talk about the concept of sovereignty, which is the principle of self-governance, usually referred to as a state's ability and right to govern its territory and the people living on that territory as it pleases. But before we start, let's make it our goal that by the end of this video, we will be able to define and analyze the concept of sovereignty a bit better than Mr. George Bush, because it is much more complex than that. Check this out.
Yeah. Tribal sovereignty means that it's sovereign. You've been given sovereignty and you're viewed as a sovereign entity. And therefore, the relationship between the federal government and tribes is one between sovereign entities.
Oh, George. Even though in this case he is talking about the relationship between a tribe and a federal government, we can apply the same logic to understand the relationship between two sovereign states, because they too are sovereign entities. And I mean, he's not wrong. A relationship between two sovereign entities is indeed a relationship between two sovereign entities. But in a globalized world, that relationship is much more complex than that. But let's start with the traditional understanding of state sovereignty. When we think about sovereignty, we usually associate the concept with states. We usually think of it as immunity. This is our land and we can do what we want with it. You keep your hands off. And it is somewhat true. Sovereignty is the principle of self-government, meaning that a state has the right to organize its domestic affairs within its own territory as it pleases, since the state is the highest form of authority on that territory. In other words, it can decide its own laws. For example, how open its media is, or how tough its internet censorship is, or whether same-sex marriage is legal or not, or how much taxes people pay. You name it. Sovereignty is a fairly new thing. It first emerged in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries when feudal societies were replaced by new forms of government. The state system as we know it today originated in the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War between the great powers of Europe in 1648. The Treaty of Westphalia was an important document as it established important norms between states, such as the principle of state sovereignty, the right to self-determination, and the principle of non-intervention that would guide relations between states from that day on. However, even though the international system is founded on the principle of sovereignty, in reality, states constantly try to exert power on matters of trade, alliances, and so on, usually through negotiations and diplomatic channels. And now there are many other actors that affect how much sovereignty states actually have. The world is increasingly intertwined, so defining sovereignty is becoming more and more complex. This is why we should distinguish between de jure and de facto sovereignty. Legally speaking, all states are sovereign, meaning that they are de jure sovereign, or in other words, de jure autonomous. But in reality, their sovereignty inevitably faces challenges from both inside and outside their borders, challenges that limit their autonomy. This begs the question whether states actually are as autonomous as we think. In other words, how de facto sovereign are they? De facto sovereignty meaning actual sovereignty. It is harder to define, especially in a globalized world where economies are interdependent, bound together by intricate webs of finance, trade, and many bilateral and multilateral agreements. States have to give up some of their sovereignty to the international system and multinational corporations who are important players in the global economy, and states need them. The fact is that the relationship between state sovereignty and the international system is by no means harmonious. International norms and laws do not always match with national legislations or norms, and sometimes states have to give up some of their autonomy in order to be part of the international system. Let's look at the relationship between these two. There is no fully agreed upon understanding of what sovereignty is and how it operates in the international sphere. Its interpretation always depends on the context, and usually actors frame its meaning in a way that serves their own purpose. However, when states agree to be part of international institutions, such as the UN, they automatically agree to follow certain rules and give up their ability to do whatever they want. So they effectively give up a bit of their sovereignty. Let's see how, for example, UN affects state sovereignty. Remember earlier when we mentioned the principle of non-intervention that was established in the Peace of Westphalia? Well, it exists to protect states and prevent them from invading each other. And the UN Charter forbids states from intervening in each other's affairs unless there is a threat to security. This again is linked to another principle called responsibility to protect, or R2P. R2P is adapted as a norm in the UN, and the Security Council has the right to execute it. It means that if a state fails to protect its own population from mass atrocity and human rights violations like genocide, it essentially gives up its sovereignty, and the UN members have the right to protect those citizens even through the use of a military intervention. UN has in fact intervened many times on the basis of this principle. In 2007, it intervened in Kenya, in 2011 in Ivory Coast, in Libya in 2011 too, and most recently in CAR in 2013. So as you can see, the concept of sovereignty is transforming all the time as international laws and norms are developed. What the future will look like? Will state sovereignty become pointless? We don't know yet. Only time will show. So here are some further study questions for you to think about. Do you think state sovereignty matters in the 21st century, or is it merely pointless? And where does sovereign authority come from? Does it come from citizens or from the international community? Thanks for watching this week's video. If you want more tips about what to watch or interesting articles to read, ask Professor Peterson more information. See you next time.